So this morning we are in week 3 of a series that we've entitled The Good Life. The idea and that name for this series came from a passage that's in the New Testament, first letter to Timothy. At the end of the 6th chapter, there's this great phrase where the writer challenges the hearers to take hold of the life that really is life. Or perhaps another way to say that would be the good life. And in that same chapter, in the 6th chapter of 1 Timothy, earlier in the chapter, there are several verses that relate to money and our relationship to money and stuff and how that can be for both good or for evil. One verse is the 9th verse where the writer says, "If it is only money that people are after, they will self-destruct in no time." Anybody ever found that to be true? If not for your own life, perhaps someone you can think of how money became a means toward self-destruction. And so there is good reason why money is the subject matter of numerous verses throughout the pages of the Bible. Because money is not just a financial or an economic issue. Money is a spiritual issue. Our attachment to money and stuff says a lot about our relationship with God. And when that relationship gets out of whack, and when our attachment gets out of whack, then it can cause all kinds of trouble for our lives and also for our relationships. And so today, part 3 of this series on the good life is about the idea of giving generously. I'm so grateful to both Jay and Tavonda for being a part of the video today, and they shared some golden nuggets in their comments that really are critical for us to remember. I loved when Jay mentioned how, through this process of beginning to practice generosity, God was changing his attitude toward his money, and how Vonda talked about how in giving, there always seemed to be blessing coming back. Those are two core foundational ideas that we'll come back to today. So I want to say this at the outset, though. On the one hand, preaching a message about generosity at a time of year when the church has set its budget and is planning to fund that budget for the coming year and is asking people to be a part of funding that budget can sound self-indulgent. So to the cynic and the skeptic, I just want to say, I get it. All right? And I also want to say this on the other hand, that if money is a spiritual issue, and I believe that it is, and if practicing generosity is one of the key components of living the life that really is life, the good life, and I believe that it is, and if the work of the church matters and makes a difference, not only in the lives of the people who are here, but in the lives of people in our community and in the world, and I believe that it does, then perhaps this is just the right time and place for us to talk about it. Jesus had more to say on the subject of money than just about any other subject. So it must have been pretty important. And so one of the places we're going to go today is to the Gospel of Matthew. And in the 6th chapter, as a part of the Sermon on the Mount, we hear some words from Jesus about a basic orientation of the heart. So follow along now with me as I read these verses from Matthew 6. "Stop collecting treasures for your own benefit on earth, where moth and rust eat them, and where thieves break in and steal them. Instead, collect treasures for yourselves in heaven, where moth and rust don't eat them, and where thieves don't break in and steal them. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And then in the book of Proverbs, we find nuggets of wisdom about lots of subjects, one of which, again, is the subject of money and our connection to it. So hear these verses from Proverbs, and you can follow along again. Those who give generously receive more, but those who are stingy with what is appropriate will grow needy. Generous persons will prosper, and those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. The word of God for the people of God, and God's people say, thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? Come, Holy Spirit, and tune our ears and hearts toward you this morning. And now breathe life into the words of this servant, that they might carry a word from you into our hearts and lives. Amen. In those verses from the 6th chapter of Matthew, we hear Jesus talking about an orientation of the heart. Our relationship to stuff and to wealth is a matter of the heart. And that is a matter that gets played out in the choices that we make, even on a daily basis. And so, one of the things I want to suggest at the outset today is that in order for us to reorient our hearts, we have to reorient the choices that we make. And we have to reorient what our use of money says about what our priorities are. And in the year 2017, a lot of us need some help thinking about how to do that, or having encouragement to do that, because there are lots of messages that come our way that say, feed me first, feed the beast of me first, satisfy yourself, go ahead, do it, it'll feel good. It's about your own personal satisfaction. Those are values that come from the world. But as Bishop Robert Schnase points out, they are at odds with the values that are at the core of our faith. And so we need a reorientation to take place for us. And so today I want to share a few suggestions, 4 practices actually, that I think can be a part of that reorientation. Now, all 4 of these practices are grounded in biblical principles of stewardship, and they are ways for us to do that reorientation. So if writing notes is helpful for you, I encourage you to do that. I give you permission to do that as I'm talking today. And I also want to offer a disclaimer up front that I'm still a work in progress myself. You know, Catherine and I made the decision the first year we were married that we, as a part of our use of money, would tithe, that we would give 1/10 of our income to the church, and that we would use other resources as we are able to be generous in other ways. But we are still works in progress, and I'm convinced that there is still more that I can do, and I'm trying to learn from God about that myself. And so I'm inviting you into a journey along with me for us to go deeper and become more trusting of God with our stuff. So practice number 1, great place to start, is to celebrate the simple things. Celebrate the simple things. Earlier in the 6th chapter of Timothy, we hear these 2 verses. Since we entered the world penniless and will leave it penniless, if we have bread on the table and shoes on our feet, that's enough. And it is, isn't it? At the end of the day, that is enough. And so to live with a grateful heart and an acknowledgement of the simple blessings that we already have can begin to free us from the incessant need to accumulate. We're almost to Thanksgiving, and next week as we get even closer, we'll spend some more time looking at the idea of living gratefully and how that can shape our perspective on life. Number 2, buy less and buy smarter. It was John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who preached in his famous sermon on the use of money, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. So let me talk about that middle piece for just a moment of saving all you can. Wesley, when he used that language of saving, was not talking about stockpiling for himself. Wesley's purpose in saving was to spend as little as he could to only acquire what was absolutely needed for his daily living so that he could save the rest and be primarily with all of that more generous with others. So save all you can by buying less and by buying smarter, because these are two practices that demonstrate we are aiming to be better stewards of all that God has entrusted to us. Why spend more when it's possible to spend less? And so let me give you just a couple of practical applications to this. One is, use things up before replacing them. There's a lot of money that gets spent just to have the newest, latest, greatest. Or when we get tired of one thing and so we go, well, we'll just throw that on the trash pile and go get something else to replace it. Can you begin to imagine all that we could save if we simply used things up before replacing? And I'm talking about small things and big things, like cars. I was happy to see this past week, actually, in some research I was doing, that in America, over the last decade, we as a nation have begun extending the time period between when we purchase vehicles. It used to be that it was about every 4 years. Now it's about every 6 years. Some of us feel like we can go a lot longer than that and be perfectly fine. And imagine how much gets saved as a result of that. Use things up before replacing. That's good for your pocketbook. It's also good for the environment, I might add. Secondly, beware of the impulse buy. It is so easy to buy quickly today. All it takes is one click on the iPad. Or for that matter, today you don't even have to use your finger and touch the iPad. Some of you can just call Alexa and ask Alexa to have it delivered to your door the next day. So much immediate gratification going on, and so much waste in the process, and if we're honest, a lot of decisions along the way that we probably regret later on. So here's an idea for you. One practice you could put in place in your household. Anytime you are about to make a purchase that would be equal to or greater than a full day's wage or income for you, take a step back and pray about that purchase first. And if you're married, then talk and pray about it together with your spouse. It just might begin to help you get a grip on some spending and help you make that move toward reorienting. Households in America have way too much stuff, and in the process take on way too much debt. Here are a couple of statistics for you from a Time article from not long ago. Children in the U.S., we love to spend on children, right? Children in the U.S. make up 3.1% of the world's kids. But U.S. families buy more than 40% of the toys worldwide. 3.1%? 40%. The number of storage facilities in the U.S. to hold all that stuff that we've acquired outnumbers all of the McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger Kings, and Starbucks combined in the U.S. Look it up. Perhaps you remember the story that Jesus tells that we read about in the 12th chapter of Luke, about the man who is so proud of himself for all that he has accumulated. So much so that the barns that he had were not enough to hold it all, so he built bigger barns to hold it all. And then right at that point when he was ready to just enjoy it all and sit back and take it easy, what happens? He dies. There's a country song with a line in it that perhaps says it better than any other. I've never seen a hearse with a trailer hitch. Number 3, be adaptable. And this is a big one for us in American society, I think especially, because we are so inclined to the notion that we are always growing, always moving upward, but life is not always upwardly mobile. Stuff happens. Circumstances change. And so one of the things that we have to be able to do is to have the ability to live with less, to adapt to those changes in life circumstances that come. So let me give you one example from my own life. 1995, Catherine and I are both in our early 30s. We've been living in Tallahassee for a few years. We both have full-time incomes. And then I finally come to grips with my call into ministry, which means packing everything up, moving to North Carolina, going back to school, which means now graduate school expenses. And oh, by the way, now we have a 2-year-old to care for as well. We no longer have 2 full-time incomes. And so in order to be responsible, we could not continue to live the way that we could with 2 full-time incomes and no kid. It meant a lot of days again with cans of tuna fish and rice cooked in chicken broth. But life is adaptable. And it's okay to adapt to the circumstances in order to be able to continue living into a responsible way of life. We are not entitled, my friends, to a certain standard or status of living. And sometimes we just have to tighten our belts. I'm reminded of the words of the writer of Ecclesiastes, who says, "To everything there is a season." And as Paul writes himself, sometimes there are seasons of plenty, and sometimes there are seasons of need or want. And we can adapt to those seasons and seek to live faithfully in all the seasons of life. Number 4, how many of you have heard it said that it's a good idea to live within your means? Not a bad idea. I'm going to give you an even better one. Live below your means. Live below your means, and here's why. When we say live within our means, it gives us permission to use up everything that is within our means, which means we have nothing left to save for a time when we might need it down the road, or to bless others through generosity. If we are going to be faithful in our finances, I believe that we will learn to live below our means. Just because you can afford it doesn't mean that you need it, or that it's a good idea even. A couple of scriptures that come to mind for me on this one. Remember when the Israelites are wandering through the wilderness and they are relying on God to provide for them, and the manna falls each day, and God instructs them on the 6th day that on that day they need to save some of what falls, because on the 7th day no manna is going to fall. And they need to have food to eat on the 7th day as well as the 6th. Can't always use up everything that's within our means. And then also in the book of Exodus, we read in the commandments a very important one about the practice of reaping what one has sown. And what God instructs the people of Israel is not to reap their crops to the edges, that they are to leave some of the gleanings, so that those who are in need can be provided for as well. I can think of no better example of living below one's means than going back to John Wesley again. Remember that his mantra to save all you can was specifically for the purpose of being able to give all you can. And every time I start to want to pat myself on the back for thinking maybe I'm doing well in this journey of generosity, I am confronted and challenged by Wesley's witness. You see, Wesley, over the course of his life, earned more and more income. In fact, at one point, he had one of the highest annual incomes of anybody in England. But early in his life, he figured out how much he needed to be able to provide for his needs. And he continued to provide for himself out of that amount for the rest of his life. So by the time he reached that point where his income was so high, he was not practicing the tithe, where he lived on 90% and gave 10%. Wesley practiced the reverse tithe. He lived on 10% and he gave away 90%. 4 practices. Celebrate the simple things, buy less and buy smarter, be adaptable, and live below your means. These 4 practices can begin to help reorient our relationship to our stuff, and practically they equip us to be able to be more generous. They free both our hearts and our wallets. And the great paradox is this: that when we practice generosity, we practice it intending to bless others, and it always seems to come back to bless us as well. This is the message that we see in the verses from Proverbs today. And when that verse 25 talks about the generous prospering, I think that word prosper is referring to a lot more than material well-being. It is that idea of finding a deep joy, of being refreshed, as that passage says, because of our generosity. And here's one thing I know anecdotally for sure. The happiest people that I have ever met are the ones who are the most generous. Without a doubt. Without a doubt. So there's one story from my own life that I keep going back to as a reminder for me. 1987, in our early 20s, Catherine and I venture off to Atlanta, Georgia to both go to seminary. Both in graduate school, both full-time students, one part-time job between the two of us, time to tighten the belt. And we've been living in Florida, and we moved to Atlanta. And sometimes in Atlanta, as it starts getting close to winter, it gets pretty cold. So we're heading into that winter season, and I have no winter coat. So one day we happened to drive by a flea market that a church is putting on there in Kennesaw, Georgia, where we were living. And so we get out and we're wandering through the flea market, and there's a clothes rack. And on that clothes rack, I notice a coat. This coat, actually. And so I take the coat off the hanger, and I try it on. And I go, well, what do you know? That coat fits me pretty well. And I look at the price tag, and it's $5. 30 years later, it's still the coat that's in my closet that I go to on a cold day. I love this coat. I love putting it on. I love it because it keeps me warm. And I also love it because every time I put it on, it's a reminder to me. It's a reminder that every day I can make choices. And the choices that I make can bless others. And when those choices end up blessing others, what always becomes true is I end up feeling blessed myself. So this morning, I dare you. I dare you to trust more. I dare you to risk more. I dare you to allow God to work on reorienting your heart. Let God help you find the joy that comes through giving generously. I'm going to close today by praying a prayer that I need to hear on a regular basis, so I'm going to speak in the first person singular. But maybe it's a prayer that'll be helpful for you as well. So will you just bow your heads and pray with me? Lord, help me to be grateful for what I have, to remember that I don't need most of what I want, and that joy is found in simplicity and generosity. Amen.